So I was right. It did wind up damaging my sleep schedule. Let's kick things off with what I imagine could be a controversial statement, depending on where you are on the whole gamer spectrum. Path of Exile 2 is not a mechanically difficult game. It is a punishing game with a good degree of complexity. Those last two are both positives and negatives. More on that later. Like the title says, I hit the 100-hour mark just before the holidays, with most of that on the mercenary that I rolled on release day. That character is on the tier 13 quest, but comfortably clears 15s for a while now. Although I've not encountered any citadels, thanks, RNG, so I can't speak to the difficulty of pinnacles and the like. Putting my money where my mouth was in the previous video, link is in the card and description, I went on Media Blackout for anything remotely guide related to see how things would go for someone new to PoE but not ARPGs. Overall, I'm really quite satisfied and happy with the game, though there are some definite pain points and places where it seems like the game doesn't quite know what it wants to be. Now, this isn't Assault Fest. I want to present my impressions of where the game is now and areas I hope are improved upon by release, because the better the game is, the better the game will do, and the longer the game will be around. Getting it right out of the way up front here, the campaign experience was solid. Very few notes. The first couple acts could be harder or easier, depending on what you're playing and what RNG decides to give you on that very first playthrough. But overall, it's well done, and I'm stoked to see what acts 4, 5, and 6 bring. Really, my main point of feedback with the campaign is, despite what some of their interviews before early access suggested, I do think that the crafting system as it exists now does not play well with early progression. In fact, I think this is one area that D4 does better than PoE by affording new players, especially new players to the genre, an adequate opportunity to interact with the game's systems so that you can learn how and why make effective decisions within the game. Currency drops are better now post-patch, but still a far cry from enough to really afford proper exposure to how the systems work, and certainly not enough to set players up without being obscenely behind the curve when it comes to endgame economies and trading. While we're on the topic, crafting as a whole seems like a bit of a placeholder with the version that exists now, and to call it crafting outside of very late-game omens is, let's go with optimistically generous. Until you reach that point in the late game with those more deterministic crafting options, you're gambling. And the stakes continue rising as you slam more and more X into a rare, knowing that you're likely to produce crap, but perhaps deludedly hoping for the exception to the rule. I hit my personal tolerance level for this system around tier 8 or 9, and decided to finally go take a look at the trade site, because the entire experience was far more frustrating than it had any right to be. And could I have avoided some of that pain by trading sooner? Yeah, sure. At the same time, if the solution to crafting is just trade, bro, crafting has kind of failed. Considering what I've heard about crafting in PoE 1 and how it affords far more player agency, I have to imagine that this isn't fully baked yet, and they'd rather start with too little than start with too much and have to take things away from players later on. I do wonder, though, if the game is balanced around trading as a baseline assumption. That's obviously not great for SSF players, and leaning too hard into that mentality is part of what brought about the real money auction house situation in D3, so hopefully this gets a bit more attention. About maps and the whole one death thing. Following up on what I said at the very beginning, there's a meaningful and useful distinction between difficulty and how punishing a system is. Let's use a behavior modification lens to explain this somewhat succinctly. Difficult systems reward effective thought and action with positive reinforcement, while providing an absence of reinforcement as the tool for shaping away from the undesired behavior, in this case, playing poorly and dying. Punishing systems reward effective play with that same positive reinforcement. However, mistakes are then also shaped by the introduction of negative or aversive stimuli, represented here by the sum total of the XP penalty, burning the stone or required key for pinnacles, and burning the unique modifiers to the map. Here's the thing. The fields of psychology, and to a lesser extent marketing, have known for decades at this point, that the introduction of punishment into any behavior modification framework lessens the overall efficacy of any shaping of behavior, and contributes to things like learned helplessness or avoidance among participants. Yet, here we are. I would say that how it exists now is perhaps overly punishing when you take the widest view of the player base into account. Yeah, perhaps somewhere in the middle could be a more effective place for maps. Yeah, XP penalty? Sure, makes sense. Played a grip at Daok, doesn't bother me. Burn the key? Again, sure, makes sense. I likely misplayed and or lacked or disregarded knowledge available to me. I would say maybe leave the modifiers on the map though, since those take additional, sometimes exceptional, amounts of time and effort to establish, and losing that feels to me like an artificial consequence as opposed to a natural one. And as a rule, when it comes to behavior modification, natural consequences are almost always going to be more effective than artificial ones. Coming back to what I just said about taking the widest possible view of the player base, there's an important concept to consider. And again, I think this is one of very few things that D4 does better. Without getting too deep into it, the concept of total addressable market matters here. Cliff Notes version is that total addressable market is the maximum potential market size for a niche product or service, assuming no constraints like competition, saturation, etc. If Grinding Gear decided to make the same game as PoE 1, but with a fancy new set of graphics, well, their total addressable market would be largely the same people who are playing PoE 1 a decade later, with minimal ability to bring in new players, because if new players were interested in playing PoE 1, they'd already be playing PoE 1. By trying something different with PoE 2, they're casting a wider net into the market to reach a hopefully broader TAM. Whether we like it or not, we do all currently exist within a late-stage capitalism hellscape, so if we want the games we enjoy to stick around or continue being made, the companies which make them do need to turn a profit. One way of working towards that end is seeking a larger total addressable market. On stream recently, one of our regulars said it quite succinctly. It's okay to have a niche product, but less so to have a niche demographic if you want to have staying power. Now, coming back to in-game systems, there's a pretty notable shift in economics as you progress into mid-game maps. Mid-game being tiers 8 to 12-ish. With the waystone and tablet sustain systems, as well as the rate of currency and item drops. That is, until you've really gotten into the habit of taking the most efficient pathing between towers to juice other maps with multiple league mechanics, or you have advanced knowledge of this nuance. Again, this doesn't add a layer of difficulty. It adds a layer of punishment. Further, I think this implementation is a large contributor to the recent proliferation of and near mandatory status of Rarity gear, which honestly is worthy of its own video, due to the downstream effects on the economy and new player experience, but suffice to say, item rarity on gear lets people push back on the multi-layered punishments I just outlined, so maybe we wouldn't need it if the underlying issue here was addressed. Penultimately, without spending too much time on it, because it is early access after all, there is certainly some work to be done on overall balancing. Classes swing pretty far in terms of comparative power level based on what I've seen since coming out from under my rock and getting caught up with content on the game. Mid to late game systems relating to defenses and survivability are not great, and were what drove me to dig up the math under the hood, because it felt like no matter how much armor I stacked, it kind of didn't matter. Tweaking things like overwhelm and the interplay between notables could go a long way here, but I'll leave design decisions to Grinding Gear and stay in my lane. A while back, there was an interview where a developer said that, and I'm paraphrasing, players are excellent at identifying what feels bad, and awful at producing effective solutions to those things without contributing to or creating downstream problems. Amusingly, I have a similar perspective when it comes to many software engineers, but again, topic for a different video. Now, I'm going to keep naively saying this, and maybe one time I'll be right. I'm still holding out hope that eventually a dev somewhere will learn from others' mistakes and buff underperformers instead of only nerfing frontrunners. Or maybe do both. Balance. Madness, I know. On some level, yes, this is like Charlie Brown thinking he's totally going to kick the football this time. I get it. We can hope. Now, as for other nitpicks and odd quality of life things, here's what jumps out at me. Dear God, please give us a sort button. Inventory Tetris is so 2003. I get that the intent is for our decisions to have consequences, but not being able to overwrite runes kind of feels like a mobile game mechanic. Don't do that. We already lose the rune by overwriting it, and this feels like a way to artificially inflate opportunity cost and gameplay time. We can tell. If significant points of interest in a map aren't going to stay on the overlay after we've discovered them, giving us map markers would be cool. Remembering where a specific thing is because you're going to do it after clearing the rest of the rares doesn't add to difficulty, it adds to annoyance. Last, for a game wanting to be known for having meaningful drops, most of mine wind up as shards to feed the map sustain or gambling systems. Maybe my RNG isn't great, but I'm running around with about 150% item rarity. Wrapping things up here. Successful pieces of media generally tend to share one common thread. They know what they're about, and everything else in that piece of media is in service of that core concept. The early access build that we're playing feels disjointed in this regard. The campaign is exactly what they promised, with epic boss encounters that emphasize iterative, incremental learning, and viewing death as an opportunity to learn what you did wrong as you interact with systems and mechanics that many players can't just face roll through. Transitioning to maps, though, the content on offer here feels as though it's a minimum viable product, which does admittedly make sense given the whole early access thing, though I've been burned often enough on that I'm limiting myself to cautious optimism that grinding gear will carry the thread of aboutness across the finish line at release. The timeliness and effectiveness of patches right after early access dropped are heartening, and at some point a decision needs to happen about whether the endgame is about blasting or not, and whether punishment is something that fits with their design philosophy, and more importantly, fits with the total addressable market they envision. All in all, I'm happy with the game. And even though this might sound like a litany of salt, these are areas I think could feel better because I want the game to be a success and reward all the effort and love that have gone into making it already. I've been Bald Squid. I'll see you next time.